Beyond the sunburnt coast, stone and iron stand guard over Australia's most brutal, trapped history. These are not relics. They are cages. Deep inside the forgotten walls and rusted cannons, the ghosts of fallen soldiers and forgotten prisoners still scream. Prepare to meet the fury locked within the top 15 haunted forts in Australia. 1. Fort Scratchley, Newcastle, New South Wales. The wind whipping across Shepherd's Hill felt colder than the Tasman Sea, a relentless, salt-laced gale that moaned through the embrasures of Fort Scratchley. At night, when the city lights of Newcastle dimmed beneath the cliff face, the massive battery position became a silhouette of paranoia and forgotten duty, a perfect stage for the lingering dead. The air tasted of ozone and ancient stone, heavy with the phantom discharge of guns that hadn't fired in anger for decades. Fort Scratchley, established in the late 19th century and the only Australian coastal defense to fire on an enemy vessel during World War II, holds within its deep tunnels more than just history. It holds the echoes of intense confinement and sudden, brutal fear. The official histories speak of diligent gun crews and strategic defense. The unofficial stories whisper of accidents ignored, disciplinary suicides hidden in the subterranean gloom, and the crushing psychological weight of waiting for war to arrive. One legend, meticulously repeated by former custodians, focuses on Gunnar Thomas, a man detailed to the subterranean magazines in 1942, who vanished entirely 3 days after the Japanese submarine attack. The manifestations are unnervingly consistent. Security personnel report a profound temperature drop near the officers' mess staircase, often accompanied by the distinct smell of stale tobacco and spent cordite. Most disturbingly, visitors to the central traverse tunnel speak of a figure, sometimes seen, more often felt, a pressure on the shoulder, a sudden, panicked breath felt against the neck. This presence is invariably described as male, dressed in period khaki, standing just beyond the reach of the faint emergency lighting, perpetually waiting for the all-clear that never sounded. Few dare linger past midnight, when the heavy steel doors echo shut with a hollow finality. The true horror of Fort Scratchley is not the enemy that attacked from the sea, but the silent, terrified defender trapped within the concrete maze. He remains down there, forever listening for the sound of the enemy shelling, an eternal sentry whose vigilance became his tomb. 2. Fort Largs, Taperoo, South Australia. The salt-laden air off Gulf Street. Vincent always carried a certain melancholic chill, especially around the formidable stone structure of Fort Largs, built in the late 19th century to defend South Australia from naval attack. The battery's low, heavy profile and concrete casemates seemed less a monument to military might and more a repository for old, unquiet grief. Long after its cannons fell silent, the fort transitioned to police training grounds, a place where discipline was paramount, yet where an unseen presence frequently broke ranks. The persistent legend among recruits focused on a specific, unmarked tragedy dating back to the fort's operational peak. A young soldier, according to the whispered accounts, died in a senseless accident within the magazine or the underground tunnels, a death that was hastily covered up to maintain morale. His spirit, denied official recognition and proper burial, became tethered to the cold stone and echoing passageways where the scent of cordite once mingled with desperation. The manifestation of this lingering entity is subtle but unnerving. Police cadets frequently report feeling a sharp, icy breath on the back of their necks when navigating the dark internal stairs. Even during the height of summer, objects in the barracks rooms, particularly hats or boots, are inexplicably moved or thrown across the floor by an unseen force, always accompanied by a faint, sorrowful sigh that seems to resonate from the stone itself. Maintenance staff, tasked with securing the deep, dusty tunnels, have reported brief, spectral glimpses of a figure in archaic uniform, dissolving into the impenetrable blackness just beyond the reach of their flashlights. The fort stands empty now, awaiting redevelopment, but its silence is deceptive. On clear, moonlit nights, visitors approaching the ramparts have heard the distant, muffled sound of marching feet, a solitary patrol tracing the perimeter, echoing a duty that was never properly discharged. Fort Largs is not merely a historical landmark. It is a meticulously preserved prison for a soul still bound by the rigid, unforgiving architecture of an old military secret. Three, Fort Nepean, Portsea. Victoria, the wind off Bass Strait is a constant, mournful voice at Fort Nepean, whipping the dry coastal scrub and rattling the heavy ironwork of the vanished gun emplacements. It is a place designed for defense, but history suggests it never truly repelled an invasion, only trapped its residents in the ceaseless gray monotony of military duty. The air here holds the density of forgotten fear, particularly within the cramped subterranean corridors of the old searchlight post and the former quarantine station nearby. Fort Nepean, sitting at the narrow tip of the Mornington Peninsula, commanded the entrance to Port Phillip Bay from the 1880s through the Second World War. Its claim to fame is firing the first Allied shot of both global conflicts, yet the legends that cling to the jagged coastline are less about ordnance and more about the desperate souls held here during outbreaks of plague and influenza. These were not warriors defending a homeland, but prisoners of disease, often buried summarily in unmarked graves where the sand shifts constantly. Visitors often report a profound, unnatural cold spot that settles within the abandoned engine room bunker. Regardless of the temperature outside, the phenomenon is frequently accompanied by a crushing sense of dread and the faint, rasping sound of desperate breathing, too close to be the wind. The most disturbing recurring apparition is the White Nurse, a spectral figure seen gliding along the cliff path after sunset, identifiable only by her faded uniform cap and the terrible stillness of her face. She is said to be searching, eternally patrolling for patients lost not to illness, but to the harsh disciplinary regimen of the isolation barracks. To stand on the fort's parapet as the fog rolls in is to be enveloped in the inescapable silence of the dead. Sometimes, just before dusk completely claims the bay, the distinct, metallic clang of a heavy door shutting echoes from the empty subterranean tunnels below. It is the sound of closure that never came for those quarantined spirits, forever trapped within the cold, unrelenting granite walls of the lonely, forgotten fortress. 4. Fort Glanville, Semaphore, South Australia. The salt-laced wind whipping off the Gulf, St. Vincent carried a deep, unsettling chill, far colder than the autumnal air suggested. Fort Glanville, squatting silently on the Semaphore coastline, felt less like a relic of colonial defense and more like a tomb facing the vast, indifferent ocean. The stonework, built to withstand cannon fire, now seemed only to contain a concentrated residue of fear, a silent echo of the tense, claustrophobic lives once lived within its thick, sandbagged walls. During its active years in the late 19th century, the fort was a nerve center of coastal artillery, but legend whispers that its true trauma stemmed not from overseas threats, but internal tragedy. A young, fiercely dedicated gunner, Private O'Malley, was mistakenly killed during a nighttime training exercise. A fatal miscalculation involving the heavy Armstrong cannon in Battery 2. His death was officially recorded as accidental discharge, but the troops knew better, muttering about poor lighting, excessive discipline, and a shadow that had been seen near the muzzle moments before the blast. O'Malley, deprived of a proper soldier's death and burial, was said to have simply refused to leave his post. Visitors and maintenance crews decades later consistently report the chilling signs of his perpetual duty. The heavy iron door of the armory will often slowly swing open, despite being triple bolted from the outside, its ancient hinges groaning under an invisible force. The most unnerving manifestation occurs deep in Battery 2, where the distinct, rhythmic drag of heavy boots is heard pacing the perimeter, the sound abruptly ceasing near the platform where O'Malley fell. On especially dark nights, a faint, acrid smell of burnt black powder lingers near the magazines, accompanied by a sudden, intense drop in temperature, suggesting the ghost remains perpetually ready for a threat that ended over a century ago. To stand alone within the battery at twilight is to feel an unseen hand pressing into the small of your back, urging you forward, perhaps toward the mouth of the inert cannon. Private O'Malley is not a malicious spirit, merely a disciplined one, eternally ensuring the fort remains operational. And if you listen closely to the roar of the sea, you can sometimes hear a sharp, ghostly command echoing over the ramparts, a final, fatal order barked out across the empty expanse. Five, Fort Queenscliff. Queenscliff, Victoria. The salt-laced wind whipping across Port Phillip Bay carries more than the scent of the sea at Fort Queenscliff. It carries the residual chill of lives devoted and often tragically ended in defense of the colony. The dark basalt walls, erected in the 1880s, possess a palpable density, a containment field not just against invasion, but against the passage of time itself. As twilight deepens, the fort becomes a mausoleum of martial memory, the air tightening around the foundations of the old lighthouse and the gun emplacements. One persistent narrative woven into the fort's history centers on the drowning death of a young signalman in the late Victorian era, lost during a sudden squall while attempting to secure vital equipment. Though the specifics vary, some say he was crushed, others swept into the bay. The resulting spirit is consistently described as a mournful entity. It is this tragedy, overlaid upon decades of military discipline and sudden, violent training accidents, that accounts for the fort's oppressive atmosphere after the gates close. The most frequent reports focus on inexplicable sounds emanating from the narrow, winding passageways beneath the parade ground. Visitors and staff have documented the distinct, rhythmic creak of heavy boots on the upper floors of the drill hall when the building is verifiably empty, and the fleeting, cold sensation of someone brushing past in the tight confines of the battery observation post. Security cameras occasionally capture anomalous shadows near the historic Black Lighthouse, and electronic equipment suffers sudden, localized interference, a phenomenon staff attribute directly to the residual energy of the signalman, perpetually seeking to complete his interrupted duty. On moonless nights, the spectral lamplight is said to appear in the shuttered windows of the oldest officers' quarters. This light is not static. It moves purposefully, a patrol that never ends, casting long, distorted shadows onto the meticulously maintained parade ground. To stand alone near the perimeter at midnight is to feel the weight of perpetual vigilance, the cold dread that accompanies the realization that some soldiers never stand down from their post, even long after death has relieved them of their earthly command. Six, Middlehead Fortifications, Mosman, New South Wales. The sea fog that rolls across Sydney Harbour rarely brings peace to the cliffs of Middlehead. Instead, it seems to carry the damp chill of forgotten duty, seeping into the concrete casemates and battery observation posts that scar the terrain. By midnight, the silence at the old coastal fortifications in Mosman is so profound, it feels less like an absence of sound and more like a compression, pressing in on the solitary sentinels who sometimes patrol the deserted parkland. Built initially in the 1870s, the fort was a crucial defense against enemy shipping. But like most sites of prolonged military occupation, it absorbed more than just strategic intent. Local whispers suggest that during the dark days of the World Wars, Accidents, and perhaps worse, were hastily buried beneath layers of bureaucratic silence. The steep, narrow tunnels designed to move ammunition now act as conduits for something far less tangible. The restless energy of soldiers whose service, it seems, never truly ended. The most persistent encounters occur within the subterranean magazine nearest the George Head Lookout. Visitors report a sudden, dramatic drop in temperature, followed by the faint, distinctive smell of aged cordite and damp wool uniforms. Security personnel have recorded inexplicable audio anomalies, a scraping sound consistent with heavy boots dragging across gravel, followed by a sharp, whispered command in a language that is sometimes English, sometimes indecipherable. The apparition, when it appears, is fleeting, a tall, shadowy figure leaning against a rusted iron gate, its form defined only by the way it seems to absorb all available light. Those who trespass after dark invariably describe the same chilling phenomenon, the feeling of being perpetually observed from the gun emplacements above, and the undeniable urge to retreat, spurred on by the ghostly sound of marching footsteps echoing down the long-since decommissioned firing steps. The Middlehead fortifications remain vigilant, but not against ships of state. They are now manned by a silent garrison, endlessly guarding the bay against a threat that died long ago, trapped forever in the salt-laced stone. Fort Denison, Sydney, New South Wales. The fog that night did not so much roll over Sydney Harbor as it simply materialized, a thick, brine-soaked shroud that clung suffocatingly to the stone walls of Fort Denison. Known locally as Pinchgut, the small, solitary island fortification felt particularly isolated under the pallid glow of the city lights, filtering weakly through the mist. It was a place steeped in grim history. Originally, a penal site where unruly convicts were often chained to the bare rock and left to the mercy of the tide and the elements. A brutal legacy that the island seemed to perpetually retain. This foundation of suffering lends credence to the persistent stories that trouble the caretakers who occasionally stay overnight. While the current tower is a Victorian structure, the underlying trauma of the original convict prison is what seems to have seeped into the very bedrock. The primary entity reported is not a soldier or an officer, but a residual echo of a prisoner named William, supposedly left to die chained to the iron ring on the eastern side. His torment reportedly manifests not as a full apparition, but as a chilling, deep-set sorrow that drops the ambient temperature even in high summer. The most disturbing incidents involved the tower's spiral staircase and the gun deck. Multiple witnesses have reported hearing the unmistakable, rhythmic drag of heavy iron chains scraping against stone, sometimes accompanied by a low, guttural moan that sounds painfully close. On 3 separate occasions, the heavy iron door of the observation post has been found unlatched and swung wide open, despite being meticulously secured hours earlier by staff who swear they felt a distinctly cold, damp breath on the back of their neck as they turned the key. But the truly terrifying element is the sound of the ocean suddenly overwhelming all other noises inside the tower, a cacophony of rushing water and panicked choking. Last month, a Marine security officer reported fleeing the deck after sensing the strong, sickening smell of salt and decay, followed by the sound of furious, desperate splashing right beside him. Though the sea remained 30 feet below, Fort Denison is a monument to survival, but those who linger there often encounter the ghost of someone who did not, forever trapped between the rising tide and the unforgiving rock. Fort Drummond, Newcastle, New South Wales. The air above Fort Drummond, perched precariously on the cliffs overlooking Newcastle Harbor, never truly warms. Even on the brightest summer afternoon, a cold, damp chill permeates the sandstone bunkers, carrying with it the undeniable scent of salt and decay. The fort, built in the shadow of imperial anxieties and long since abandoned by its military purpose, now serves as a crumbling monument to things best left buried. Visitors often report a profound sense of surveillance, an acute feeling that they are trespassing in a domain fiercely guarded by its unseen occupants. The darkest legend concerns Sergeant Elias Thorne, a career soldier stationed at Drummond in the late 1890s. Thorne was a disciplinarian known for his brutal, almost pathological paranoia regarding coastal invaders. One fog-choked night, convinced he saw the lights of an enemy vessel, he ordered the cannon battery to fire upon what was later confirmed to be a local fishing trawler. The resulting inquest destroyed him, but before the military police could arrest him, Thorne vanished within the deep ventilation shafts beneath the main magazine. His body was never recovered, and locals whispered that the fort itself had consumed him. Today, Thorne's oppressive presence is the fort's defining feature. Deep inside the magazine, where the acoustics create unnatural echoes, people hear the rasping sound of a belt being tightened, followed by the clatter of heavy boots marching across concrete that hasn't been trod upon for 50 years. Furthermore, the light fittings in the officers' mess, even those recently replaced, flicker violently, sometimes dying completely, plunging the observer into sudden, absolute darkness. It is said that Thorne abhors the intrusion of modern light into his eternal watch. The most unnerving manifestation occurs near the old battery platform, where the sergeant made his terrible mistake. Witnesses have claimed to see a gaunt shadow, dressed in antiquated military garb, standing silently at the precipice. If approached, the figure doesn't flee, but simply turns its head, a movement described as impossibly slow, to fix the intruder with an expression of pure, unadulterated suspicion. Then, a low, guttural voice, like gravel dragged over stone, whispers a single, accusatory word that chills the spine. Intruder. Fort Drummond remains ever vigilant, locked in a perpetual Cold War fought by a ghost who never accepted defeat. Point Nepean Quarantine Station, Port C. Victoria, the jagged coastline of Point Nepean is perpetually lashed by Bass Strait winds, carrying the sharp scent of salt and eucalyptus across the abandoned compound. Even on clear days, an oppressive silence settles over the skeletal timber structures. This isolation, originally designed to keep contagion out of Melbourne, now serves only to trap the echoes of despair within its borders. The peeling paint and rusted iron stand as bleak monuments to a necessary, brutal separation from the wider world. Established in 1852, the quarantine station processed thousands of immigrants arriving with smallpox, typhus, and bubonic plague. It was a site of forced confinement and immense human suffering, where the sick were stripped, fumigated, and confined to bleak hospital wards to either recover or succumb. The nearby cemetery, resting just a short, despairing walk from the main barracks, holds the forgotten dead. Staff and patients alike succumb to the virulent conditions, leaving a heavy psychic residue of fear and desperation clinging to the cold limestone walls. The most active location is reportedly the old disinfecting complex, a concrete bunker where all new arrivals were processed. Parapsychological researchers report a profound, localized temperature drop near the rusty immersion baths, and the distinct, metallic aroma of carbolic acid often permeates the sealed air when no chemicals have been present for decades. Furthermore, visitors frequently recount hearing labored, wheezing coughs emanating from empty rooms. These auditory disturbances are abrupt and unnerving, often cutting short, as if the suffocating illness finally won the battle for breath. Shadows are occasionally seen moving with deliberate, mournful slowness across the floors of the isolation wards. Figures perhaps perpetually waiting for a clean bill of health or a ferry that will never come. The history here is not merely a historical record. It is experiential. To walk the desolate grounds of Point Nepean is to walk through an invisible field of misery, where the boundary between past and present is terrifyingly thin. The quarantine may have officially ended, the fences dismantled, but the lingering presence of those who died alone and afraid ensures the suffering remains permanently sequestered on this remote, windswept point. Then Fort Cowan, Morton Island, Queensland. The salt-laced wind whipping across Morton Island always carries a sigh, but at Fort Cowan, that sigh sounds distinctly like regret. Built in haste to guard Brisbane during WW2, the concrete bunkers and rusting gun emplacements now stand as silent, weathered monuments to a forgotten paranoia. By day, tourists clamber over the ruins. By twilight, the true residents emerge, drawn from the dense scrub and the deep, collapsing tunnels beneath the sand. Local folklore surrounding Cowan focuses heavily on a period of intense training and subsequent tension between the Australian and American troops stationed there. The most persistent and terrifying legend involves a young Australian signaller named Thomas, accused of espionage by American officers under ambiguous circumstances. Though the official record states Thomas was transferred, the lingering whispers claim he was interrogated, tortured, and ultimately disappeared into the choked, vine-covered fortifications overlooking the bay. His desperate final moments, trapped and pleading within the narrow confines of the battery observation post, are reportedly etched into the very structure. Visitors exploring the fort after dark often report intense, localized cold spots within the deepest battery rooms, accompanied by the faint, rhythmic scratching of Morse code that abruptly ceases when approached. But the most alarming manifestations occur near the observation post. People claim to hear muffled screams and the metallic scrape of boots on concrete, followed by an agonizing silence. Anyone brave or foolish enough to use a flashlight inside the post has occasionally caught a fleeting glimpse of a pale, young face pressed against the dusty glass aperture, eyes wide, staring out not at the sea, but fixed in a perpetual panic. The specter of signaller Thomas remains bound to Fort Cowan, not merely haunting the place, but actively trying to communicate a long-silenced injustice. To stand inside the post at midnight is to feel the air thicken with suffocating fear, realizing you are not merely standing in an abandoned ruin, but inside the sealed, concrete tomb of a man begging to be heard, condemned eternally by the unforgiving silence of the Australian night. Garden Island Fortifications, Garden Island, Western Australia. The concrete bunkers of Garden Island, remnants of Fremantle's vital WWII defenses, are not simply abandoned, they are repositories of deep, silent anxiety. The wind off the Indian Ocean howls through rusted ventilation shafts, not sounding like natural movement, but rather a long, drawn-out sigh from structures built purely for vigilance and death. Though the island is heavily restricted, those who monitor the restricted coastal sectors speak of the heavy atmosphere that settles particularly around the massive gun emplacements and the spiderweb of subterranean tunnels used for ammunition storage and communication. The history here is less about direct combat and more about agonizing psychological pressure. Servicemen stationed within these cold, isolated positions charged with watching an empty sea for U-boats or invasion forces that never materialized suffered intense claustrophobia and the grinding certainty that if action came, their posts would become immediate tombs. Local naval legends whisper of a young telegraph operator in the primary observation post who, overwhelmed by the silence and the strain, took his own life near the main rangefinder in 1943, creating a fissure of despair in the heart of the defenses. His distress, they claim, manifests as acute cold spots that cling stubbornly to the main staircase, defying the dry heat of the West Australian summer. Equipment malfunctions are common within the old command center, Radios transmit inexplicable bursts of antique static, and sometimes the pungent, stale aroma of 1940s pipe tobacco floods the concrete rooms, only to vanish instantly. But the most specific horror occurs near the western firing coordinates. A rapid succession of phantom footsteps, heavy boots running down the corridor, fading just as they reach the dead-end wall, suggesting an urgent, desperate message that was never quite delivered. The Garden Island fortifications remain vigilant, manned not by living soldiers, but by the shadows of men forever trapped in a state of eternal, anxious readiness. The structures are simply concrete shells, holding the echoes of a war that ended decades ago, but whose stress patterns refuse to dissipate, guarding a threat that only they can still perceive. Sure, Kangaroo Island Fort, Kangaroo Island, South Australia. The salt-laced wind whipping across the jagged promontory of Kangaroo Island felt less like a natural force and more like a desperate, searching sigh. Even under the glare of the southern sun, the remains of the old fort were unsettling. Gray, cyclopean stones half swallowed by the scrub, brooding over the perilous, turquoise waters. Tourists came for the view. Historians came for the ill-fated colonial outpost. Locals, however, kept a respectful distance, knowing the structure held more than just historical weight. It was a tomb, built on a lie of security and stained by desperation. The fort's history, shrouded in poorly kept records, spoke of a quarantine station turned makeshift garrison during a period of intense rivalry with other colonial powers. But the true terror arrived not by sea, but from within. A virulent fever swept through the barracks in 1868, compounded by the isolation and dwindling supplies. Panic morphed into barbarity as the healthy walled up the sick, sealing them into the lower magazine vaults to prevent the spread. A desperate act of preservation that led to a gruesome, suffocating demise for nearly 20 souls. The official record calls it sanitation. The stones remember it as murder. Today, the residual energy of that suffering clings to the site like a perpetual cold mist. Visitors report a sudden, profound drop in temperature near the old powder room, even in the height of summer. The most disturbing phenomena, however, occur after dusk. Security personnel, unwillingly posted near the ruins, have consistently documented faint, rhythmic scraping sounds echoing from beneath the foundation. The awful, futile scratching of fingernails against the inner granite. These sounds are often accompanied by a low, congested rattling, the sound of lungs filling with dust and despair. On nights when the fog rolls in thick from the investigator strait, a spectral figure is sometimes seen leaning against the crumbling battlements, a gaunt soldier, perpetually scanning the horizon not for the enemy, but for the relief that never came. If you approach, the figure doesn't vanish. It turns its hollow gaze directly towards you, and a stench of old linen and sickness floods the air. It is not an aggressive presence, only one profoundly, agonizingly abandoned, forever trapped on the desolate edge of the island, counting down the long, final moments of a death forgotten by history but preserved by the unforgiving rock. Surside, Fort Lytton, Brisbane, Queensland. The humid air of the Brisbane River mouth hangs heavy over Fort Lytton, clinging to the sandstone walls built in the 1880s. This coastal fortification, designed to repel enemy ships, holds a silent history far grimmer than any wartime engagement. Decades of grueling training, isolation, and tragic accidents imbued the brickwork with a residual dread. Long before its decommissioning, whispers circulated among the garrisons about the intense sorrow radiating from the gun emplacements and the cramped, mildewed tunnels below. These early accounts spoke of sudden, intense cold in the subterranean battery rooms, even during the scorching Queensland summers, and the overwhelming scent of old, metallic gunpowder lingering long after the last shell was fired. Paranormal investigation teams routinely focus on the battery observation post, and the deep, circular magazine rooms, visitors report hearing the distinct, rhythmic scrape of heavy boots marching across the parade ground. Yet visual confirmation always fails. More disturbing are the encounters within the dark casemates. Witnesses describe being physically shoved or feeling an icy grip around their ankle. Movements attributed to a stern, unseen sergeant major who refuses to abandon his post. The temperature drop in the magazine is often so dramatic that cameras fail, plunging the space into absolute darkness, punctuated only by sudden, distant coughs echoing from passages known to be empty. The most persistent anomaly centers on the isolation cells. Originally used for quarantine cases in the late 19th century, security footage sometimes captures swift, blurred shadows flitting across the barred windows, too rapid to be native wildlife. Experienced caretakers speak of a palpable sense of observation, the feeling of being critically judged by non-corporeal eyes. To stand alone at dusk near the massive, silent muzzle-loading guns is to understand that the defense of Fort Lytton continues, maintained by a spectral garrison that believes the river mouth is still under imminent threat. They are soldiers eternally confined to the cold, echoing dampness, defending a country that has long since forgotten their specific sacrifice. Green Hill Fort, Thursday Island, Queensland. The wind on Green Hill Fort is perpetually heavy, a humid current carrying the salt spray high above the Torres Strait. Established in the late 1800s, this defensive bastion was meant to guard the vital northern shipping channels, a silent sentinel against naval threats that never fully materialized. Now, the rusting gun emplacements and concrete casemates are merely relics. Yet the oppressive isolation suggests that something other than tropical decay lingers in the silent bunkers. The fort's duty failed to engage an external enemy, but its history is stained by the silent tragedies of isolated garrison life, where tropical disease and the brutal monotony of remote deployment were the true adversaries. Local lore focuses on the sudden fatalities inherent to military isolation. The most consistent legend involves a young artilleryman, Ensign Rourke, who succumbed rapidly to a violent fever or perhaps an accidental self-inflicted wound near the main magazine around 1901. Visitors and caretakers report deep, resonant thermal fluctuations within the underground structures, often accompanied by the distinct, fleeting smell of cordite and mildewed wool. The palpable chill of the gun battery rooms is particularly unnerving, defying the intense Queensland heat that radiates off the hill. The lingering presence of Rourke is said to guard the narrow, echoing passageway leading to the former observation post. These manifestations are rarely visual but intensely auditory. Security recordings and night watch logs have repeatedly captured the sharp, rhythmic cadence of heavy leather boots marching across the concrete parade ground. Late at night, a sound that always abruptly halts near the former sleeping quarters. Even more disturbing are the claims from maintenance workers who have heard disembodied, labored breathing coming from the deepest service shafts, invariably accompanied by a faint, metallic clang, suggesting the dropping of a rifle bolt or equipment failure. Green Hill Fort failed to see action in any conflict, but it appears its isolated duty continues indefinitely, overseen by the restless spirit who never stood down from his final post. Bear Island Fort La Perouse, New South Wales. The air around Bear Island Fort, separating Botany Bay from the Pacific, always tasted of salt and forgotten dread. Built in the 1880s to defend Sydney, the stone casemates and dark tunnels now offered only silence. A vast, oppressive quiet broken occasionally by the groan of rusty metal or the distant, rhythmic crash of waves against the causeway. Historians acknowledge the strategic importance of the site, but locals speak of the prisoners, the colonial casualties, and the sheer density of suffering absorbed by the sandstone. The most persistent legend centers on the spirit of Private William Hill. In 1891, Hill was stationed here, a young guard consumed by melancholic isolation, driven to madness. He took his own life within the cramped confines of the North Battery magazine. His demise was swift, but his tenancy was permanent. Hill's despair never truly left the fort. It manifested as a residual psychic chill that drops the temperature of the innermost chambers by alarming degrees, even on the hottest summer afternoons. Visitors and maintenance crews frequently report encounters near the former magazine entrance. They describe a heavy, dragging footstep approaching from empty space, the faint, acrid smell of burnt powder wafting through the narrow passages, and the sudden, irrational urge to flee. More chillingly, the spectral figure of Private Hill is sometimes observed. He is not malevolent, merely perpetually trapped, a pale, uniformed shadow-standing sentinel, his back to the living, staring out through a loophole at a threat that ceased to exist over a century ago. To stand alone within the echoing shell of Bear Island Fort after sunset is to become acutely aware that you are sharing the space. When the wind whistles through the embrasures, it sounds less like a natural phenomenon and more like a whispered, desperate order, eternally reenacting the final, fatal moment of a lonely soldier whose post remains tragically manned. That wraps our tour of Australia's most chilling military ruins, from the spectral sentinels of Fort Scratchley to the restless spirits guarding Battery Largs. These locations prove history is truly haunted. If these tales gave you the chills, hit the like button, subscribe for more chilling content, and let us know which fort scares you the most in the comments. Until then, keep watching the shadows.